For our preliminary task, we had very little time in terms of planning. We received a brief in which we knew we had to involve continuity editing, a variety of distances and angles, pans, steadicams, handycams, a 180-degree rule and 2 lines of action. Therefore, we based our narrative around these shots that were compulsory within the sequence. Despite this, we did include a storyboard prior to shooting, where we had identified our 6 main shots that we wanted to include. This featured the 180-degree rule when the main character was sitting at a desk, as well as an upwards pan towards the clock. It also featured a tracking shot as the character is walking along the corridor, along with a smooth transition through the door. Furthermore, we also planned on shooting another tracking shot as he walked towards the door to meet Marcos, as well as a regular mid-shot unveiling Marcos. Therefore, our main planning for this preliminary task was the storyboard. Nevertheless, we had to include many other shots in our piece that were not included in it. This meant that at times we had to think innovatively and creatively to make the sequence continuous. On the other hand, in our final piece, we planned our sequence in a lot more detail. Initially, we had multiple lessons in which we had to decide on a location. At first, we carried out a location recce to discover the best location for our clip. However, fortunately, our team member Tom has a very eerie-looking caravan at his house, which we utilised for our clip. From this location recce, we could therefore depict the shots that would look effective and conventional of horror to put in our piece. Similarly to our preliminary task, we had to storyboard the shots that would look the most effective. At this point, we decided to use flashbacks in our piece to show that the caravan has a past in terms of murder and torture. This made it very difficult to storyboard as we were unsure as to how the flashbacks were going to work, and we were also unsure about the transition shots in between flashbacks. As well as this, we had to be organised in terms of equipment that was needed. Therefore, we had to contact our media supervisor to ask about the availability of the track, the tripod and the camera. Though despite this, the camera was not needed, as we were lucky enough to be able to use my teammates' Canon DSLR camera, which improved the quality of our shots immensely in terms of resolution.
In terms of our preliminary task, our footage was set in school and therefore we were all wearing school uniforms. Despite this, Marcos the drug dealer had a large coat on to present a contrast to the schoolboy who wanted the drugs. We used this coat to show Marcos as a slightly older, shifty character who does not attend school. On the other hand, for our final piece, we used a lot in costume terms, especially for our main stock character, Darren. In the clip, Darren is presented as a hiker, therefore he wore hiking boots, cargo trousers and a long thick coat conventional of a hiker. Despite this, our antagonist had a costume which was very conventional of horror. I say this because the antagonist wore all black and had a rather freakish white mask to cover up his identity, which is typical of horror to form a sense of the unknown. When discussing the preliminary task in terms of location, as we stated before, we shot in school and therefore that was the location for our clip. On the other hand, the location for our final piece was a mysterious-looking caravan which is conventional of horror and has connotations of murder and torture, and this was explored through our flashbacks. Also, my teammate's house was a small woodland area which was also iconic of horror as it has a connotation of isolation and loneliness. So we also utilised this woodland prior to Darren's discovery of the caravan. In terms of lighting for the preliminary task, we used artificial lighting as the lights were all on the inside of the rooms and the corridors. On the other hand, in the final piece, there was evidence of natural lighting, and when Darren walked through the woods, the sky was rather grey and gloomy, which presented a parallel with the mood of the clip. Also, the inside of the caravan, there was no artificial lighting, and we had to use natural lighting from outside, which created quite a dim, shadowy effect. In terms of our characters, in both pieces it featured the same actors. In the preliminary task there was a schoolboy and a drug dealer, and in the final piece there was Darren, a young hiker and the masked antagonist. The sound in our preliminary film sequence consisted of both non-diegetic and diegetic sounds. The sound effects we added in post-production included a ticking sound of the clock and a backing track introduced mid-sequence in an attempt to create suspense. This was achieved through sharp, fast-paced sounds comparable to those found in chase scenes. The clock sound effects were added in contrast to the silence of the examination hall to emphasise the desperation of the character for his drugs. This integration of an emphatic sound with complete silence was utilised through the flashbacks in our final piece. The dialogue itself was in Spanish to make it more unique and independent. We replicated this unique aspect of our preliminary in our final film sequence to the backing track When I Paint My Masterpiece. a cheerful, thus unorthodox backing track for a psychological horror. We faced issues with the sound in our location, as most of our filming took place in a music block of the school, so interference was inevitable. This meant that inserting a backing track previously mentioned in the preliminary was also a method used to suppress the sound interference created by it.
The idea for the plot was created from the basis of what shots planned, filming previously. For example, the inclusion of the 180-degree rule meant there had to be a conversation or confrontation for us to film, giving us the idea to have a drug deal in which the two characters conversed for a brief period. We used a similar style of filming with our final piece, in which many of our shots were improvised on the day, which led to a larger variety of flashbacks. The first scene, where Harry is shown in an examination hall, was a device used to build up tension for the following drug deal. We replicated this style through the use of flashbacks in our final piece. This built up tension and enigma up until the protagonist's death. Likewise, in our preliminary task, the signal of desperation given off by the character's body language and uncontrollable shaking eventually led him to becoming overpowered by the escaping drug dealer. The strengths and weaknesses of our final clip. As a group, we are extremely pleased with the overall look of the piece, especially the flashbacks, as it could have easily gone horribly wrong. However, by altering the grain of the image, changing the colour, and inputting sufficient sound effects, it soon looked very effective. Another strength of our piece were the quality of the shots we used in the piece in general. This included a pull focus shot, 2 tracking shots, a POV shot, and an effective over-the-shoulder shot, which unveiled the caravan. Another strength of our piece was how the soundtrack faded out and then the diegetic sound came in as Dan went into the caravan. A quick switch between the soundtrack and the diegetic was extremely effective and created a sense of uneasiness. Despite this, there was a weakness in our clip, and this was finding the appropriate font for our title. At first we used a font named Cold Night for Alligators, yet that particular font was associated more with the slasher subgenre rather than psychological. Therefore, with little time to find an appropriate font, we'd find it a more suitable font, yet some thought it was a bit basic and ordinary and could have been improved.
In terms of camera and editing, there were both similarities and differences between our preliminary task and our final opening. The main one of these differences being that the camera we used for the preliminary task, a Panasonic HDC SD10, was a lot less quality and resolution than our chosen camera for the film opening, a Canon EOS 600D. This allowed for our shots in the opening sequence to be a lot of higher quality. This meant many of our shots were very easy to film, like our pan shots and mid shots. In comparison to our horror sequence, the shots were often a lot more complex, like our tracking shot across the caravan and the shot in which the camera was positioned inside a cupboard.
In terms of editing, we followed the same method of continuity editing in both the preliminary task and our horror opening. This was because we wanted both our clips to flow smoothly and make sure the narrative was clearly understandable to our target audience. This was to make sure there was no confusion with our concept. However, with the addition of flashbacks in our opening, this broke continuity in some places as the time frames were different. This made our opening more effective than the preliminary task, as it was more complex, allowing us to venture into other parts of editing, including adding brightness and contrast effects to our flashbacks to make them look more sinister. Adding effects to some of our shots was challenging at times, as they could often look distorted, making this process a lot more time-consuming to find the right balance in colours. For example, the dominant green shade given to the flashbacks to make them look dirty in order for our audience to be uncomfortable. Additionally, we used fades in both our preliminary and horror opening tasks, making shots run smoother, as the transition between them was more gradual as opposed to sudden, which could often make them look of amateur quality. We often had issues with the rendering of clips on this software during our preliminary task. However, this task allowed us to make the editing process of our horror task much more time effective, as the issues were minimalised because we now knew how to resolve most of the problems. The pace of editing differed with the preliminary task and the opening. The preliminary task started off quite fast-paced in order to show the character in distress. This pace gradually slows down throughout the clip as the character gets nearer to getting what he wants, the drugs. This opposes to our horror clip, which starts a lot slower as our protagonist is not in much distress, gradually increasing its editing pace as tension starts to rise within the caravan and the flashbacks begin.